think the most important lesson from the past is when one looks at the development of the history of the 20th century. German historians were quite right to say that the First World War was the original catastrophe. But the Russian Civil War, which was actually the subject of my latest book, was the events which really established the history of the 20th century and even many of the problems that we have today, because it was the vicious circle of fear which the horrors of the Russian Civil War created. The sadism, the cruelty, the destruction, the disease which followed and all the rest of it meant that everybody throughout Europe and across the world was then split between these two sides, between red and white, between Bolshevik and fascist, and between communist and capitalist. And this particular pattern meant that we see the process of dehumanization of the opponent, rather in the way as the wars of religion of, say, the 17th century and earlier had shown how terrible humanity can be when it is following hatreds based on either idealism or on ideology, at any rate. And as I say, this is the most important lesson, because we're seeing today again this vicious circle of fear and of hatred, because it's the combination of fear and hatred. As Goebbels, with his diabolical genius, recognized in the Second World War, that hatred alone was not enough. It is the combination of hatred and fear which really produces that killing momentum which the Nazis needed in their war on the Soviet Union. We are seeing, I think, very disturbing echoes of this today. And this comes particularly through social media. It's interesting the way that even in the past, you know, when writers who were angry had a blank sheet of paper, and they could be people who could be very kind and normal human beings, but when they started writing their real fears and their moral outrage came out, we see a completely different animal appearing. And this, I think, is particularly alarming when one knows that intellectual honesty is the first casualty of moral outrage. And we're seeing this moral outrage today with the supporters of Trump, who cannot understand why life has been so bad for them, and feeling that there is a conspiracy against them. And this is why they will believe conspiracy theories, which often are ridiculous. But one must understand the sources of their anger and of their resentment. And we don't realize that actually this started very much at the time of the greatest hope, which was 1989, 1990, the end of the possible Cold War, the end of the possible World War, which we'd thought about between communism and capitalism. And the way that we thought that, you know, there'll be peace in the future, the peace dividend, that we wouldn't have to spend so much on armies and all the rest of it. All of this, I'm afraid, was a fantasy, which has now really been, I think, shattered, because the old tensions, the old alliances have changed into new alliances now, where we now see, instead of communists and capitalists, we now see the authoritarians, the autocracies of China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, creating a new alliance, and the democracies of the United States, Europe, and elsewhere trying to oppose that. So, do we see a fear of another world war? The trouble is, world wars are a combination of conflicts. As we saw with the Second World War, it wasn't just one conflict or anything like that. There were many which came together. And we are seeing, you know, North Korea versus South Korea. We're seeing China and Taiwan. We're seeing Iran and Israel. All of this, to say nothing of course, of Putin and the Ukraine. And so there is a danger that these different conflicts could coalesce into an even greater general war. But that doesn't mean it will necessarily happen. We just must be aware of the danger. Unfortunately, we have this democratic confirmation bias, that progress is continual, that everything will get better and better into the future. But we're now actually seeing a pushback. We've seen this just in the American elections. We shouldn't have been surprised. I mean, I was pretty sure that Trump was going to win, because one is well aware of the change. This idea that sort of, progress will be, everybody will be more liberal, more loving, and all the rest of it, is certainly not true, and is not going to, it's not something which is predictable, which is going to continue. We are seeing people, again, angry and resentful, because we are seeing the change in society, we're seeing the change in economics and in employment. People are frightened. And that's why they start looking for an authoritarian leader. I mean, one's only got to see the research, say, in France. 24% of the population believes that the army should take over. We're seeing, that there's almost a majority who is afraid that for the future of democracy. And the trouble is, democracy is vulnerable because in a globalized world, democratic politicians have actually very little control. There's very little they can do to improve things. In most cases, all they can do is make things worse. And this, of course, is something which people cannot understand. It also means that to prove or to, in fact, to be elected, they have to make promises which in most cases they know they cannot fulfill. And this, of course, creates a great resentment against democracy. So the only thing we can do to improve things is to make sure that politicians are not making promises which they can't fulfill. But that, I'm afraid, is perhaps hoping for too much. I mean, it is the way that competitive politics works. One of the reasons why people are fascinated by the past, it's a perfectly good one, is that in those days, life was much more judgmental. And moral choice is actually the center, the real focus of nearly all human drama. And today, we do not see moral choice in the same way as people did in the past, which actually means that many of the issues today are simply less dramatic than in the past. So this is why so many of the feuilletons, of the television series, of the movies or whatever, are set in the past and therefore in historical terms. Also, unfortunately, in most countries, history is not really taught properly in schools or even in universities, and it's actually sort of declining there. And yet, and this is the paradox, or in fact the consequence, that because history is badly or less taught in schools and universities, people have a greater hunger and a greater interest in history itself. So we do see a problem in the way that people, or rather the television companies, the channels, the film companies, want to make use of history. But the trouble is they want to make it even more dramatic, and therefore they distort history partly through historical fiction. Now, I'm not like some historians who condemn all historical fiction as a corruption of history. There are some very good historical novels and so forth. But the trouble is that people today now get their knowledge of history, or what they think is their knowledge of history, from fiction, i.e. from movies and television series and so forth. There are some very good TV documentaries, some excellent ones. I mean, I've taken part in a whole number, and there are even some very good ones today. But of course, there's also pressure on documentary filmmakers from the channels to make things even more dramatic. And of course, that again means the corruption of historical values. So, things aren't necessarily going to get better in that particular way. But I mean, I think it's important that people do understand history better and the lessons. But at the same time, it's not an escape, and it's not a question of it being able to tell them what the future is going to be. History is not a predictive mechanism. I mean, I find it a tremendous paradox that one's always asked onto news programs to predict the future. And you have to say, well, hang on a second, I'm a historian, I study the past. I cannot predict the future just because I know about the past. I can only say what are the lessons and what we should be afraid of. And of course, as I say, one of the things we should be most afraid of is this vicious circle of fear and resentment, which in fact is what dominates so much of the conversation on social media today. Well, one of the most important books of recent years has only just been recently published by Anne Applebaum, which is Autocracy, Inc., explaining the way that we see these different autocracies of China, Russia, North Korea and others linking together and exchanging support and not so much ideas, because they all have very similar ideas already, unfortunately, but certainly of help in suppressing freedom amongst their own populations, but also by interfering in the democratic process which opposes them in other countries. And Autocracy, Inc. is a brilliant book, but it is also a very depressing book. I mean, I told Anne Applebaum, who I've known for a long time, I said, your book is absolutely brilliant, but it's the most depressing book I've read in a very, very long time. And she shrugged her shoulders and said, I'm sorry, that's true. And of course, she is quite right. Well, other books recently, the trouble is, I'm afraid most of my reading is obviously concentrated on the books that I am working on at the moment. And I only really allow myself a chance to read novels in between major books. And there are many novels which, of course, I will always go back to. Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, one of the great books, I think, of literature, which is enough to teach any would-be writer or novelist the economy of description, where by simple inflection, by simple ideas, you can convey so much in terms of atmosphere, in terms of character of individuals. And I think, as I say, it is the greatest lesson for any wannabe writer. Gabriel Garcia Marquez used to say, you know, one should be able to sum up things in, and he described it, he said, the smell of a rotting guava, to give the impression, if you like, of decay, corruption, whatever it might be in, say, the sort of country like Colombia where he grew up. And it's terribly important that a novelist can produce in a few words both a character and an atmosphere, and even almost a whole society, just through small descriptions. And I think also it's terribly important for historians to be able to summon up through certain details, both human, but even physical, an atmosphere, to be able to convey something so people can recognize the way that they are actually talking about something very different indeed. But I mean, of course, there are other you know, great novels, which one, like obviously Tolstoy, War and Peace, where you can talk and convey the feelings of a whole society through just a few characters. And War and Peace is absolutely brilliant in that particular way. I mean, what's irritating about War and Peace is when Tolstoy starts making his historical lessons and lectures in different bits. But I mean, you know, one can skip that if necessary. But you will always learn more about humanity through the characters in War and Peace than through so many other different novels. In terms of other histories recently, or which are basically there, we have a couple of novels and of course one book on current affairs. But I mean, there have been some, if you like, brilliant histories in the past, or biographies. I mean, I think Ian Kershaw's 2 volumes on Hitler gives one a far better idea of how somebody like Hitler, a small man coming to power and creating a terrifying dictatorship. It gives you an idea of somebody like Putin, who suddenly, through opportunity, in his particular case, suddenly comes to power and is able to impose his vision on a vast country. Well, in the case of Kershaw, I mean, his points whereby, without psychological speculation, because historians should not really go in for historical speculation, Kershaw is able to show Hitler's characters with all of its paradoxes, all of its complexities and complexes, above all, his own psychological problems. I mean, I once asked a very brilliant and famous psychiatrist, how as a psychiatrist you would analyze both Hitler and Stalin. And he thought about it, and he also was somebody who was in any way fascinated by history. And he made the usual qualification saying that as a psychiatrist, you should not really speculate about somebody you've never met but he said, I think you can be reasonably certain that in the case of Stalin, he was a paranoid schizophrenic because of the various parts of his past. I remember Simon Sebag Montefiore, who's a great friend, when he wrote about Stalin's youth. In the Georgian archives, there's an account where Stalin, as a young man, to impress a young woman, they were walking by a river, which was flooded. And there was a little island left where there was a calf, a baby cow, trapped. And to impress the girl, he waded out to this water and he broke each leg of the calf to impress the young woman. Well, I think that therefore the analysis of a paranoid schizophrenic or whatever was probably very accurate. But then he said, but in the case of Hitler, all I can say to you is that Hitler had a personality disorder. And I thought, oh dear, if that's all he can tell me about Hitler, that is a big problem. And again, it raises a very, very important point, I think, about history and about the way that one looks at the so-called big men, the great men of history, is what is the definition of evil? Does evil exist? As a historian, do you just treat it as a philosophical or rather religious concept? When you talk about, say, a mass murderer of history, like Hitler or Stalin, as the great Andrei Sakharov, the great Russian Soviet dissident and physicist said, he said, in the case of Stalin and Hitler, Stalin killed more people, but Hitler had to be defeated first. He was quite right. If Hitler had won in the victory in the Soviet Union, it would have been far worse than the Holocaust because he wanted to starve 30 million to death. So how does one talk about evil? How does one sort of assess it? Because, of course, nowadays the idea is nobody's really evil. They are psychologically or they are deranged, or they are they are victims themselves of their own mental derangement. So, I mean, how do you make moral choice? Is there a moral choice in that particular case? But the trouble is what is the future of morality, in a sense, if you're going to say everybody who is evil or is a killer is in fact obviously somehow a victim of their own upbringing or of their own life? Where are we in the future? So that's why I think that history actually has got a lot of big questions to answer, but perhaps it's not capable of answering them. And why I am fascinated by war, because it is the greatest challenge that humanity and the greatest activity, or in the worst sense of the term, that humanity is ever involved in.